So today we're going to look at what is basically a masterclass in political judo. How to turn your opponent's own weight and arrogance into your biggest advantage. We're diving into the incredible story of how early Indian nationalists took this completely powerless institution, this political cage the British built to control them, and flipped it into one of their most powerful weapons.
I mean, that's the ultimate question, isn't it? When an empire has all the cards, the army, the laws, the whole economy, how in the world do you start pushing back from inside the very system that's designed to keep you down?
And here's the real kicker. It's not just that the platform you're given is limited, it's that it was specifically designed to be useless. Just imagine being handed a stage with no microphone, a parliament with absolutely zero authority. That's the impossible puzzle Indian nationalists were facing in the late 19th century.
To really get just how brilliant their strategy was, we first have to look at the tool the British handed them. And as you're about to see, it wasn't much of a tool at all. This was the Imperial Legislative Council. The British set it up after the massive revolt of 1857. Now, on paper, the idea was to include some Indian voices in government, to stop another big uprising. But the reality, well, that was a whole different story.
I mean, just look at this list. The powerlessness was total. The members couldn't even discuss the budget. That's the most basic job of any legislature. They couldn't ask tough questions of the administration. They couldn't introduce any important bill without getting it approved first. This was a parliament in name only. It was a sham.
And get this, 25. That's the average number of days this so-called council even met each year. That single number tells you everything you need to know about how seriously the British took it. It was a complete afterthought.
And this wasn't some kind of accident or a design flaw. The British Secretary of State for India, a guy named Charles Wood, he said it right out loud. The goal was despotism, absolute rule controlled from thousands of miles away in Britain. The council, that was just window dressing to make it look a little better.
Okay, so if the council itself was a fake, who are the actors the British hired to play their parts? Well, it turns out they were perfectly cast for a role that required absolutely no thinking or action at all.
See, the British weren't trying to find actual representatives of the Indian people, not even close. They picked guys who owed everything they had to the colonial system. Princes, massive landowners, officials who had loyally served the British. In other words, they picked men who were guaranteed not to rock the boat.
You got to hear this story about Raja Digvijay Singh. He was nominated to the council, but he couldn't even speak English. So what was his voting strategy? He admitted he just watched the viceroy. When the viceroy's hand went up, his went up. It sounds almost funny, right? But it's also a perfect and kind of sad illustration of what a puppet show this whole thing was.
And their voting record? Wow, it really speaks for itself. Nationalists were screaming to reduce the hated salt tax. What did the council members do? They voted to increase it. The people wanted more protection for tenant farmers. They helped weaken those protections. A bill to censor the Indian language press came up. They voted for it. It was just a complete betrayal over and over again.
You can just feel the rage in this quote from nationalist leader Madan Mohan Malavia. He's basically saying, look, we'd be better off with no one representing us than with these so-called gilded shams, these magnificent non-entities who just vote against their own people every chance they get.
So you might be wondering, what was the British grand plan here? Why create this whole elaborate puppet theater in the first place? Well, it turns out they had a very specific strategy in mind.
They called it the safety valve strategy. The whole idea was to give the most vocal, educated Indians a little harmless forum where they could make their speeches, feel important, and just let off steam. The British figured this would stop any real political anger from building up and exploding into another huge rebellion.
Seriously, they genuinely believed the nationalists would be satisfied with this. They saw the council as nothing more than a toy to keep the new political class busy. They expected a few flowery speeches, some empty words, and then everyone would just quietly go home. They had no idea who they were dealing with.
But oh boy did they miscalculate. Because when the nationalists looked at this toy, this so-called safety valve, they saw something completely different. They saw a weapon.
And this right here, this is the heart of the story. This is the big twist. Where the British wanted a place to get their policies endorsed, the nationalists used it to oppose every single one. Where the British wanted them to let off a little steam, they used it to broadcast the grievances of an entire nation. They took a harmless toy and turned it into a powerful propaganda machine. See, they realized they couldn't win the votes to change the laws, but they could absolutely use the platform to control the narrative. Their speeches became weapons to expose every flaw in the administration, to hammer every bad policy, and to show the whole world the hypocrisy of British rule. They couldn't win the vote, but they could sure as heck win the argument and destroy the government's moral high ground.
Now, this strategic pivot wasn't just some idea floating around. It was embodied by a new generation of fierce, brilliant nationalist leaders who walked into those councils ready for a political fight.
And nobody, absolutely nobody, personified this new spirit more than Pherozeshah Mehta. He was one of the founders of the Indian National Congress, and he was this incredibly powerful, totally fearless debater who knew exactly how to use that council chamber as a stage for the nationalist cause.
Just listen to how he talks. When attacking a new police act, he didn't just say he disagreed. No, he called it retrograde, more open to abuse, or more demoralizing. This wasn't the polite, empty talk the British were expecting. This was a full frontal assault on the government's competence and its morality. And the British were completely stunned. The finance member, a guy named James Westland, actually stood up in the council and complained about this new spirit that Mehta had brought in. He was shocked, just shocked, that a mere native, as they saw it, would dare to criticize the great British civil service so openly.
Mehta's words weren't just speeches anymore. They were described at the time as a bomb thrown into the ranks. All of a sudden, that little toy wasn't a toy. That safety valve had been re-engineered to build pressure, not release it. The entire game had changed, right then and there.
You know, this whole story leaves us with a pretty powerful question for today. The nationalists took a platform that was designed to be toothless and used speeches, facts, and fearless debate to challenge an entire empire. It really makes you wonder, in our own world, what seemingly powerless platforms out there could be transformed into engines for some really powerful change. Definitely something to think about.